Greetings and welcome back to Scriptures Unlocked. This will be the final presentation in the series on marriage, divorce, and remarriage, as we will explore Paul's teaching on the subject of 1 Corinthians chapter 7. This will be a verse-by-verse explanation of the chapter, so as to put in proper biblical context what Paul taught on the issue. Throughout this series, it was clearly shown using the scriptures and the scriptures alone that God's law found in Deuteronomy 24, verse 1 to 4, allows for divorce and remarriage. Therefore, those who continue to insist and teach that divorce and remarriage is not allowed are essentially saying that God is a liar and are not being faithful to the scriptures. Such a view, my friends, can only be held by handling the word of God deceitfully, according to 2 Corinthians 4, verse 2, in an attempt to uphold the traditions of men and reject the commandment of God, found in Mark 7, verse 9. As is customary, I'll be sharing my study notes as we go through the presentation together. So we'll be doing a verse-by-verse explanation of 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Friends, in marriage, we have two imperfect individuals with different views coming together to live as one. So there's bound to be disagreements and differences from time to time. Therefore, when problems arise in a marriage, as it inevitably will, the first order of the day is to have communication between both parties, forgiveness and reconciliation. However, when all attempts at resolution and reconciliation have failed, then God in his word made provision for couples to end their marriage by means of a divorce. Therefore, divorce should always be the last resort when all other attempts have failed. Failure to resolve and reconcile shows clear signs of hardness of heart on the part of one party or both individuals. This is precisely why we have coined the term irreconcilable differences, which is normally cited as a reason for divorce in most cases today. Many persons have erroneously thought that remarriage is not allowed, and some have even suggested that divorced individuals can remarry only if they were the ones to initiate divorce on the quote-unquote biblical grounds of adultery. In discussions on this highly controversial topic, there's a usual mention of the quote-unquote innocent and guilty party in a divorce. However, my friends, there's nowhere in scripture that mentions such phrases as it relates to divorce, but the verses that are often used to justify that argument are Matthew 5, verse 32 and Matthew 19, verse 9, which is a clear misunderstanding of those texts. Some churches have stated that only the spouse who has been faithful to the marriage vow has the quote-unquote biblical right to seek a divorce and to remarry. Additionally, churches have also claimed that if the marriage ends in divorce, then the quote-unquote guilty party, that is, the spouse who has violated the marriage vow, does not have the moral right to remarry as long as the spouse, who is the quote-unquote innocent party, is alive and has remained unmarried. Friends, if this is done and the quote-unquote guilty party remarries, then such a person shall be removed from being a member of the church. That is, the individual will be disfellowshipped. Implicit in the view that says that the quote-unquote guilty party cannot remarry while their former spouse remains unmarried is to declare that such person must remain single and is really an imposition of celibacy upon the individual. However, such arguments are unfounded and without scriptural support, and only does more harm by stigmatizing the divorced in the eyes of the Christian community. Without further ado, my friends, let's delve into 1 Corinthians 7 so that much needed clarity can be added to this topic by looking at Paul's teaching on marriage, divorce, and remarriage. The entire chapter of 1 Corinthians chapter 7 can be divided in the following ways. Answer to questions regarding fornication and sexual relations in marriage, and that is found in 1 Corinthians 7, verse 1 to 5. Instructions to the unmarried and widows, 1 Corinthians 7, 8 to 9. Instructions to married believers, 1 Corinthians 7, verse 10 to 11. instructions to believers married to an unbelieving spouse, and vice versa. 1 Corinthians 7, verse 12 to 16. And Paul then speaks about every man abiding in his calling, 1 Corinthians 7, 17 to 24. Instructions concerning virgins, the married and the divorced, 1 Corinthians 7, 25 to 28. The advantages / disadvantages of being unmarried and married, 1 Corinthians 7, 29 to 35. Instructions concerning celibacy and marriage, 1 Corinthians 7, 36 to 38. And finally, Paul speaks about death, ending the marriage bond, 1 Corinthians 7, verse 39 to 40. I'll be exploring all these themes that are found in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 as we do a verse-by-verse exposition of the chapter. So let's now turn to 1 Corinthians 7 and read what Paul wrote to the people of Corinth. This chapter, my friends, must be seen from the point of view that Paul was responding to questions posed to him, as can be seen in verse 1. And this is what verse 1 says. Paul is speaking in his letter to the Corinthians. Now concerning the things whereof he wrote unto me. Therefore, from this text, it is plain that Paul was addressing specific issues and questions asked of him by the Corinthians. Friends, we are not privy to the actual contents of the letter that was sent to Paul, but based on his response, we can deduce that the questions had to do with premarital sex and sexual relations between married couples. Paul went on to say, and I quote, "It is good for a man not to touch a woman," end of quote, which means it is not good for a man to have sexual relations with a woman. The Greek word translated as touch is aptomai, and it occurs 36 times in 33 verses. Aptomai can also mean to fasten oneself to adhere to, or cling to. But in the context of this verse, it is referring to carnal intercourse with a woman or cohabitation. And let us go to look at the original Greek. And I'll be turning to the Blue Letter Bible so you can see the word that is translated as touch. Let's go to the Blue Letter Bible as we look at the word that is used here. So the caption here says, teaching on marriage. So now concerning the things whereof he wrote unto me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. Touch here is Strong's G 680. And this is the pronunciation.
Strong's G 680, hoptomai. Hoptomai. Thayer's lexicon, hopto. Hopto.
Okay. And this is the meaning. This is the King James count. It occurs 36 times, and it is translated as touch. To fasten oneself to, adhere to, cling to touch, of carnal intercourse with a woman or cohabitation. So this is what the word means. It means in the context of the verse, it is talking about carnal intercourse with a woman or cohabitation. So let's go back to the notes. So Paul was saying that it is not good for a man to have carnal intercourse with a woman or essentially to get married at this time. Question, why would Paul advise against a man cleaving to and having sexual relations with a woman? We'll be exploring that. Did not God say that it is not good that the man should be alone? Therefore, God went on to say, I will make him an help, meet for him. And God created Eve and gave her to Adam. Question, did Paul have something against marriage or women? The answer is absolutely not. Paul was only advising against marriage based on what was occurring at that time in the city of Corinth. Paul's discouragement in verse 1 is attributed to two main reasons. One, the present distress, as will be explained later, and two, divided devotion or split loyalty between God and a person's spouse. Paul was not forbidding marriage, but was speaking within the context of what was happening at that time. This is crucial in understanding what Paul taught on the issue of marriage, divorce, and remarriage in the entire chapter of 1 Corinthians chapter 7. In fact, the next verse supports the point that Paul had nothing against marriage, and this can be proven by what he stated. This is what Paul stated in verse 2. After he said, "It is not good for a man to touch a woman," Paul said, "Nevertheless, to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife, and let every woman have her own husband." 1 Corinthians 7, verse 2. Notice what Paul said. It is good, based on the present distress, for a man not to touch a woman. Nevertheless, to avoid fornication, let every man, every means every, let every man have his own wife, and let every woman have her own husband. The word let means allow or permit. So in other words, do not prevent or do not forbid. Paul was therefore saying that because of the present distress that is mentioned in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 26, it is better not to marry at this time. However, if you cannot contain or control your sexual desires, then go right ahead and get married in order to avoid fornication. Friends, it is absolutely clear from this verse that the reason given by Paul why each man is to have his own wife and each woman is to have her own husband is to avoid fornication. And fornication here simply means marriage, means sex outside of marriage. Therefore, anyone who teaches that divorced individuals cannot remarry is essentially encouraging fornication, because they would be seeking to prevent the divorced from the very means given to them to avoid fornication. Paul tells us that those who are, quote unquote, forbidding to marry are giving heed to seducing spirits and are teaching doctrines of devils, according to 1 Timothy 4, verse 1 to 3. These are not my words. These are Paul's inspired words. Therefore, it is contrary to God's will to preclude or prevent either a man or a woman from having a spouse, because God created humanity with sexual desires and needs that must be satisfied, and marriage is the only institution given to mankind where this should be accomplished. This takes us now to 1 Corinthians 7, verse 3 onwards. This is what Paul continues to say. Let the husband render unto the wife due benevolence, and likewise also the wife unto the husband. So within the marriage relationship, both the husband and wife must render the necessary affection due to each other. Paul makes the point that there is mutual responsibility in marriage, and that both the husband and the wife are obligated to fulfill each other's needs. Verse 4 says, "The wife hath not power of her own body, but the husband. And likewise also, the husband hath not power of his own body, but the wife." Paul again states that in marriage, the husband has full authority over his wife's body, and so does the wife over her husband's body. Each person has full access rights to the other person's body, but this does not mean that the husband or wife have any license to abuse or coerce the other, whether sexually or otherwise. That's not what Paul was saying. Paul, in his letter to the Ephesians, in chapter 5 and verse 28 says, "Husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies, because he that loveth his wife loveth himself." Both the husband and the wife are to meet each other's sexual needs. Therefore, it is wrong to withhold affection and intimacy from each other. And in marriage, in Jamaica, we tend to say, when women are withholding intimacy from their husband, we say that they are locking shop. Paul is saying that there should be no locking of shop in a marriage relationship. And this he goes on to say, which makes the point. Paul says, "Defraud ye not one the other, except it be with consent for a time, that ye may give yourselves to fasting and prayer, and come together again, that Satan tempt you not for your incontinency." It would appear that the Corinthians were in the habit of abstaining from sex relations in marriage. Therefore, Paul had to instruct them not to defraud or deprive each other of his or her conjugal rights, except it be with consent for a time. The apostle discourages the lack of sexual intimacy in marriage, because this may give rise to the deprived looking outside the marriage for sexual satisfaction, and this may and can put a strain on the relationship. To withhold sex from your spouse is to open the door for Satan to tempt you for your incontinency or lack of self-control. Friends, after giving instructions concerning fornication and how the married are to relate to each other sexually, Paul then adds his own advice and opinion on the matter. This can be seen by the following statement, which he makes abundantly clear that this is not a commandment. Verse 6 of the chapter says, "But I speak this by permission and not of commandment. For I would that all men were even as I myself. But every man hath his proper gift of God, one after this manner and another after that." Paul here was merely using himself as an example, because it is evident from his statement that at the time of writing, he was unmarried and hence included himself among those who were unmarried as well. The apostle recognized the benefit of being single at that time, or at this time during the present distress, but also noted that other persons may not be able to exercise the same level of self-control. Paul, my friends, was very mindful to ensure that it could not be misconstrued that he was imposing celibacy on anyone. This is why he referenced that every man hath his proper gift of God, because celibacy is a gift as well as a choice. This also ties in perfectly with what Jesus said in Matthew 19, verse 12. And this is what he said: "There be eunuchs which have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. He that is able to receive it, let him receive it." So eunuchs can mean persons who have been castrated. But in this part of the verse, Jesus was saying that there are some persons who have chosen to make themselves eunuchs, meaning they have chosen to abstain from sexual relations or even getting married. Some persons, as we know, are able to resist sexual temptations and live holy lives, while others cannot. So to deny the only institution provided by God to avoid fornication is to pretend that we know more than God and to put ourselves in the Creator's stead. The Apostle Paul then addressed this section of his letter to two groups of single individuals, and we'll be looking at these individuals. So Paul, after speaking about what we just read about, Paul then turns attention to two groups of single individuals, the unmarried and widows. Notice 1 Corinthians 7, reading from verse 8 and 9. Notice who Paul is addressing in this part of his letter. "I say therefore to the unmarried and widows." So Paul is clearly addressing the unmarried and widows. Keep that in mind. "I say therefore to the unmarried and widows, it is good for them if they abide even as I, remain single. But if they cannot contain, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn." Friends, it is very important to understand what the term unmarried means, because persons are of the mistaken belief that divorced individuals are not classified as unmarried. Friends, viewers, "un" is a prefix, and a prefix is added to the start of a word to change the meaning of that word by giving it an opposite or negative meaning. The prefix "un" almost always means not, and gives the new word the opposite meaning of the original word. Therefore, unmarried means not married and includes those who are single, divorced, as well as widows and widowers. The Greek word translated as unmarried is agamos, which is the Strong's number, Strong's G 22. Paul is the only author that uses this word, and it occurs only 4 times in 4 verses of the Greek concordance of the King James Version. The Greek word agamos can only be found in 1 Corinthians 7, verse 8, verse 11, verse 32, and verse 34. And it simply means unmarried, that is, free, single, and disengaged. Let's go to the Blue Letter Bible to look at the original Greek so you can get a better idea or to see for yourselves what unmarried means. So let's go to 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 8 and 9. So I say, therefore, to the unmarried, Strong's G 22. So it is agamos. This is the pronunciation.
Strong's G22, agamos. Agamos.
Agamos. And it occurs, as I mentioned, 4 times, and it means it is translated unmarried 4 times. Outline of biblical usage: unmarried, unwedded, single. Agamos as a negative participle, unmarried, unmarried. And these are the verses in which it appears, which I referenced. Verse 8, verse 11, verse 32, and verse 34. And we'll address those verses as we proceed in this presentation. So it is very clear for us to understand who the unmarried refers to. So unmarried refers to those who are single, those who are divorced, those who are widowed, and that includes a woman and a man who we consider to be a widower. In 1 Corinthians 7, verse 8 and 9, Paul was specifically speaking to widows and the unmarried, which includes the single as well as divorced individuals. And his counsel was that it is good for them if they abide even as I, that is, in a single state based on what was happening at the time. Bear in mind that Paul was speaking of single being quote unquote good in the context of the present distress. Paul quickly adds that even though he prefers for them to remain as he is, that is single, he says, if they cannot contain, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn. In speaking to the unmarried and widows, Paul unequivocally states, let them marry if they cannot contain their sexual desires, because it is better to marry than to burn. Therefore, those who continue to insist and teach that the divorced cannot remarry are at odds with what Paul wrote under the inspiration of God on this matter. Marriage, my friends, is a way to escape fornication so that persons don't have to burn with the raging sexual passions. Remember, God clearly said that there's no temptation that has taken you such as is common to man, but with the temptation will provide a way of escape so that you are able to bear it. So marriage is that way of escape to avoid fornication, which is sexual temptation. My friends, it must be understood that divorce ends a marriage and does what it was intended to do. So it simply means that the divorced are now unmarried. And the same is true for those who are widows or widowers. Again, Paul's instruction is, if they cannot contain, let them marry. And it is simple. Paul's instruction is vital because the divorced and the widowed are persons who are accustomed to having sexual relations with their spouse or former spouses. So it will be hard for them to be used to having sexual relations. And now, because they are unmarried, whether through divorce or being a widow, to be able to contain those sexual desires. And that is why Paul, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, commands, let them marry so that they can avoid fornication. That is plain and simple. In 1 Corinthians 7, verse 10 to 11, Paul turns his attention to the married. So Paul addressed the unmarried in verses 8 and 9. Now he turns his attention to the married in verses 10 to 11 and gives the following command from the Lord. And unto the married, I put it in red so that it stands out. Paul is addressing the married. I command, yet not I, but the Lord. Let not the wife depart from her husband. But, and if she depart, let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband. And let not the husband put away his wife. The verse is very clear. Paul is specifically addressing the married, where both partners are Christians or believers. So it must be clearly noted and understood that 1 Corinthians 7, verses 10 to 11 is not talking about divorce, but a situation where the wife has chosen to leave or separate from her husband. This is borne out by the context, because in this section of the letter, Paul is writing unto the married. Paul was not talking about divorce, but can be seen here promoting marriage by stating, let not the wife depart from her husband. Therefore, it is important to understand what depart means or mean in these verses. The Greek word translated as depart is horizo, which is the Strong's number 5563. And it occurs 13 times in 12 verses in the Greek concordance of the King James Version. It has been translated as depart 8 times, separate 3 times, and put asunder 2 times. And when all the verses in which horizo appears are examined, then the meaning and use of the word becomes quite clear. Horizo essentially means a separation in the context of these verses under consideration and not divorce. Therefore, Paul was simply saying that a wife should not leave or separate from her husband. However, if she chooses to depart, leave, or separate, let her remain unmarried, that is single and unattached, because she is not lawfully divorced, or be reconciled to her husband. Paul then adds, and let not the husband put away his wife. So he's once again promoting unity within marriage. Remember that the phrase put away does not mean divorce, unless it is accompanied by the requisite bill of divorcement, which is apostation, Strong's G 647. Let me go to the original Greek and look at the word that is translated as depart, so you can see for yourselves that depart is not talking about divorce, but simply a separation. Let's go to the original Greek and look at the word that is translated as depart. So we're looking at 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 10. And it says, let not the wife depart, Strong's G 5563, horizo. This is the pronunciation.
Strong's G 5563, horizo. Horizo.
Horizo. And it means, it occurs 13 times in the Greek concordance of the King James Version. The outline of biblical usage, it is translated depart 8 times, separate 3 times, put asunder 2 times. It means to separate, divide, part, put asunder, to separate oneself from, to depart, to leave a husband or wife. This meaning says of divorce, but it is not used for divorce in this context. It says to depart or go away. So it says here, horizo means to place room between, that is part, to go away, depart, put asunder, separate. And you can easily find out what a word means by looking at all the verses in which it appears and look at the context in which those verses are saying. So it appears 13 times in 12 verses. That's a relatively easy study to do. It says here, what God has joined together, let not man put asunder or separate. Same thing in that. Look at how it is used here. Acts 1 verse 4. And being assembled together with them, commanded them that they should not depart from Jerusalem. In other words, Jesus said to the disciples that they should not leave from Jerusalem, but wait for the promise of the Father, which said he, ye have heard of me. Notice here again, Acts 18 verse 1. After these things, Paul departed from Athens and came to Corinth. So Paul left from Athens and came to Corinth. Acts 18 verse 2. And found a certain Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus, lately come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because that Claudius had commanded all Jews to depart from Rome. Strong's G 5563, it means that the commandment was given by Claudius for all Jews to leave Rome. So the point is made. And you can go through for your own edification and look at the other verses in which depart or horizo appears in the Greek. And you'll get the idea that it is speaking specifically of leaving from one place to another. So in the context of what Paul was saying in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 10 to 11, he was speaking to the married. Let not the wife depart from her husband. So the wife should not leave her husband. It is not speaking about divorce. The Greek word translated as put away is aphiemi, which is Strong's G 863, and it occurs 146 times in 133 verses of the Greek concordance of the King James Version. It means to send away, to leave, abandon, or to depart. So both horizo and aphiemi essentially mean the same thing. That is to leave or depart from a person in order to go to another place. Let's go back to the original Greek and look at this word that is translated as put away. It is not the usual word that is used in the Gospels, which is apollo, to put away. Let's look at the original Greek. I like to be very transparent. So let's look at this word. Put away is G863, aphiemi. This is the pronunciation.
Strong's G 863. Aphiemi. Aphiemi.
Aphiemi. It means leave, forgive, suffer. It is translated in these ways. Leave, forgive, leave 52 times. So that is the dominant meaning of the word. So the husband should not leave his wife. Forgive, suffer, let, forsake. He should not forsake his wife, let alone. Outline of biblical usage. To send away, to bid going away or depart. Here it is again being used of a husband divorcing his wife, but that is not the meaning of the word in the context of the verse. To send forth, I'm giving it all the meanings. I'm not cherry picking any. So even though this meaning says it is used of a husband divorcing his wife, that is not the meaning in this context. To send forth, yield up, to expire, to let go, let alone, let be, to disregard, to leave, not to discuss now as in a topic, of teachers, writers, and speakers, to omit or neglect, to let go, give up a debt, forgive, to remit, to give up, keep no longer, to permit, allow, not to hinder, to give up a thing to a person, to leave, go away from one, in order to go to another place, to depart from anyone, to depart from one and leave him to himself so that all mutual claims are abandoned. This is in the context of the verse. To desert wrongfully, which is also in the context of the verse. To go away, leaving something behind. To leave one by not taking him as a companion. To leave one dying, leave behind one. To leave so that what is left may remain. Leave remaining, to abandon or leave destitute. And this is in the context of the verse. So it is clear from the meaning of the word in the context in which it is used. Aphiemi and horizo means to leave or to separate from one spouse. So let's go back to our study notes. So Paul was saying, if the wife departs, so Paul is saying that if the husband should not put away his wife and the wife should not depart from her husband. If the wife departs and we take that to mean that she is divorced, then the man could not be referred to as her husband, but her former husband. And you can see that in Deuteronomy 24, verse 4, where that phrase is used. After the man has given her the bill of divorcement, she is now referred to as the man is now referred to as her former husband. Again, the point must be re-emphasized that Paul was not speaking about divorce, but simply referring to a separation of one spouse from the other. Hence the command for her to be reconciled to her husband. And bearing in mind that 1 Corinthians 7, verse 10 to 11, Paul is addressing the married. So Paul was not talking about divorced individuals. He was talking to the married. And that is why he says the wife should not leave her husband, and the husband should not put away his wife. Friends, the conventional view on these verses is that the word unmarried in verse 11 means divorced. And therefore, the woman must remain celibate or be reconciled to her husband. However, Paul was only dealing with couples that are separated and not divorced individuals. So 1 Corinthians 7, verse 10 to 11 is not applicable to those who are divorced, but was only addressed to the married. Paul knows that people have choices. So if separation has taken place, then the individuals are to remain as they are or be reconciled to their spouse. they are not free to marry another, because that would be committing adultery, which is in harmony with Jesus' word in Mark 10, verse 12, which states, if a woman shall put away her husband and be married to another, she committed adultery. Friends, Paul then shifts his focus from the married believers and now speaks directly to individuals who have unbelieving spouses. So in verses 10 to 11, Paul was addressing married believers. He then shifts his focus from the married believers and now speaks directly to individuals who have unbelieving spouses who are not Christian. This shift is evident by his use of the following words, but to the rest speak I. And this portion of the letter can be found in 1 Corinthians 7, verse 12 onwards. Notice Paul's word and notice the shift to speaking to persons who are married to unbelieving spouses. But to the rest speak I, not the Lord. If any brother hath a wife that believeth not, there it is, and she be pleased to dwell with him, let him not put her away. And the woman which hath an husband that believeth not, and if he be pleased to dwell with her, let her not leave him. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Else were your children unclean, but now are they holy. But if the unbelieving depart, let him depart. A brother or a sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God hath called us to peace. For what knowest thou, O wife, whether thou shalt save thy husband? Or how knowest thou, O man, whether thou shalt save thy wife? When Paul wrote that, but to the rest speak I, not the Lord, we should not think that Paul was less inspired in what he was about to say. He simply means that Jesus did not specifically address this particular issue. But we know that holy men of God spake as they were moved by the Holy Ghost, 2 Peter 1, verse 21. And Paul was Yeshua's inspired apostle to the Gentiles. In addressing believers with unbelieving spouses, Paul once again promotes marriage by encouraging the men not to put away their unbelieving wives and the women not to leave their unbelieving husbands. The reason given by the apostle why the marriage relationship is to be maintained is if the unbelieving spouse be pleased to dwell with him or her. Paul, my friends, stated that a man should not put away his wife and the woman should not leave her husband. Therefore, implicit in the apostle's words is the idea that the women of Corinth did not have the same legal rights as the men, because husbands could put away their wives, but the wives could only choose to leave, as they could not put away their husbands. However, even in a situation where it's an unequally yoked relationship, as in a believer married to an unbeliever, Paul's emphasis is for both individuals to remain together in holy matrimony. So Paul is here again promoting marriage, as well as what I'm doing. I am here to promote marriage, but this series is to put to rest the idea that if a person is divorced, they cannot remarry. But my emphasis is to promote marriage. I've been married for 10 years now, and marriage has its challenges, but all challenges can be resolved if we allow God to be at the center of all marriages. Paul counseled the believing Corinthians to remain married to their unbelieving spouses, because even in such marriages, God can still be glorified by working through the believing spouse to convert the unbelieving spouse and win them for Christ. Conversion and salvation is still possible. Hence, Paul's statement in 1 Corinthians 7, verse 16 is given. The unbelieving spouse is sanctified by the believing spouse by virtue of being married to a believer, because in marriage, the twain becomes one flesh. 1 Corinthians 7, verse 15, my friends, has always been a controversial verse. And what really needs to be determined is whether the abandoned spouse is free to remarry without a divorce, or do they need to get divorced first. Paul's counsel is for believers to do what they can to remain married and try to convert their spouse. But if the unbelieving departs with the intention of ending the marriage, then the marital bond can be broken, because a brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases. It was never God's plan for believers to be joined together with unbelievers in matrimony. because such marriages were unlawful and considered fornication or porneia, which was discussed in a previous presentation. Though not speaking specifically about marriage, notice what Paul wrote in 2 Corinthians chapter 6, reading from verse 14 onwards. This is what Paul said. 2 Corinthians 6, verse 14. Be ye not unequally yoked together with unbelievers. For what fellowship hath righteousness with unrighteousness? And what communion hath light with darkness? These are questions that Paul posed. And what concord hath Christ with Belial, or wicked people? Or what part hath he that believeth with an infidel? And what agreement hath the temple of God with idols? For ye are the temple of the living God. Christians are, or bodies are the temple of the Holy Ghost, or the temple of the living God. As God had said, I will dwell in them and walk in them, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Paul goes on to say, wherefore come out from among them and be ye separate, saith the Lord. Friends, the Greek word translated as infidel is apistos, which is the Strong's number G571, which also means unbelieving, unfaithful, and faithless. It occurs 23 times in 21 verses of the Greek concordance of the King James Version. And the principal meaning is someone who is an unbeliever or unbelieving. Therefore, this ties in perfectly with 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 15, where the unbelieving chooses to abandon or departs. Then in such a scenario, a brother or a sister is not under bondage in such cases. Paul was clearly speaking about a marriage between a believer and an unbeliever. So this should be interpreted to mean freedom from the marriage bond, and therefore freedom to remarry as well. However, if a divorce can be sought, then it would be more prudent, especially in our time, to get a divorce from such an individual who chooses to depart from the marriage bond with no intention of trying to reconcile. There was absolutely no limitation placed on the believer's freedom from Paul's words in such a scenario, because the believer is not under bondage in such a case, which means they are free to live in peace. Let's go and just look at the word infidel to see that it means unbeliever or unbelieving. So it is 2 Corinthians chapter 6, 2 Corinthians chapter 6, and I believe it is verse 14, 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 15. The word here, and what concord hath Christ with Belial, or what part hath he that believeth with an infidel? So Paul is making the comparison between a believer and an unbeliever. Notice what the Greek is and the meaning. The Greek is apistos.
Strong's G571, apistos. Apistos.
Okay, that's the pronunciation. And it means, it occurs 23 times, means that believe not, unbelieving 5 times, faithless 4 times, unbeliever 4 times, infidel 2 times. So an infidel means someone who is unfaithful, faithless, not to be trusted, perfidious, incredible of things, unbelieving, incredulous, without trust in God, which is the context of what Paul was speaking. So it says, disbelieving, that is without Christian faith, especially a heathen, someone that believeth not, faithless, infidel, unbelieving. So Paul was saying that if the person is unbelieving, that they don't share the same faith as you in Christ, and they choose to leave with an intention not to remain married, then in such a case, the believer is not under bondage in the marriage contract. And in such case, they are free. So Paul makes it very clear. In 1 Corinthians 7, verse 17 to 24, Paul summarized and advised that let every man wherein he is called therein abide with God, which means that they should live for God in their current state or situation. It doesn't matter what your current status is when you accept the gospel, whether you are single, married, divorced, widowed, or remarried. Paul was saying, serve God as you are called, because he can use anyone for his glory. Some persons my friends, have been guilty of breaking up many marriages because they erroneously teach that only the first marriage is recognized by God. So they advocate that individuals must leave their second husband or wife and go back to their first spouse, which is contrary to God's law found in Deuteronomy 24 and verse 4. This they do in a futile bid to try and undo the past. However, there's an adage which says you can't unscramble scrambled eggs, because there are some things in this life that cannot be undone, like circumcision. Paul makes the very point when he said or asked, is any man called being circumcised? Let him not become uncircumcised. Is any called in uncircumcision? Let him not be circumcised. 1 Corinthians 7, verse 18. Circumcision, as we know, is irreversible, and a man cannot become uncircumcised after he had been circumcised. Therefore, if you accept the gospel being uncircumcised, then there's no need to get circumcised, but just ensure that you are keeping the commandments of God. 1 Corinthians 7, verse 19. And I just want to go and look at 1 Corinthians 7, verse 24 to see what that verse is saying, because I noticed I put an asterisk beside that verse. So it means that it has some level of significance in the point I want to make. 1 Corinthians 7, verse 24. Oh, it's the same verse. Brethren, let every man wherein he is called therein abide with God. And then Paul goes on to make the point that circumcision is nothing and uncircumcision is nothing but the keeping of the commandments of God. Okay, so as we continue to look at Paul's teaching on marriage, divorce, and remarriage, Paul's response to the questions posed to him, we see where he now deals with the issue concerning virgins in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, reading from verse 25 and verse 26. Notice what Paul wrote. And again, you can see the shift. Paul says, now concerning virgins. So clearly Paul is addressing another question that was posed to him by the people of Corinth. Now concerning virgins, I have no commandment of the Lord. So Jesus, when he was here, did not speak specifically on this matter. Yet I give my judgment as one that had obtained mercy of the Lord to be faithful. So Paul is still speaking under the inspiration of God. I suppose, therefore, that this is good for the present distress. And here it is now, where everything that Paul is saying in this chapter, in his response to the Corinthians, must be viewed within the context of the present distress. So we are now looking at the present distress. So Paul is saying, based on the present distress, it is good for virgins, it is good for a man so to be, to remain a virgin. So Paul, in speaking to those who were never married, that is virgins, stated that based on the present distress, it is quote unquote good for them to continue to be so and remain single and chaste. What was this present distress? This is important because Paul's letter and advice to the Corinthians seems to have been predicated on this present distress. It is apparent from Paul's words that there was a current problem or persecution in and around the city of Corinth, which was causing some amount of distress to its citizens. Therefore, Paul was outlining the distinct advantages of remaining single during this present distress. He then digressed from specifically addressing virgins so as to include those who are bound and those who are loosed. This was to make the general point that because of the present distress, they too were to remain in their current state or as they are. Notice his words in verses 27 and 28. And these are very important words. Art thou bound unto a wife? Seek not to be loosed. Art thou loosed from a wife? Seek not a wife. But, and if thou marry, thou hast not sinned. And if a virgin marry, she hath not sinned. Nevertheless, such shall have trouble in the flesh, but I spare you. So based on the current distress, Paul was advising, stay in the current state that you are. So if you are married, bound here means married. If you are married, in the context of the verse, if you are bound unto a wife, and there it is a wife, seek not to be loosed. Don't seek a divorce. don't seek a separation. Art thou loose from a wife? If you are divorced, do not seek a wife. Don't get married based on what was happening by the current distress. But Paul then says, but, and if thou marry, thou hast not sinned. And if a virgin marry, she hath not sinned. Nevertheless, such shall have trouble in the flesh, but I spare you. So Paul was trying to spare them from the disadvantages that can arise from being married at a time of the present distress. So in the context of Paul's letter on the issue of marriage, divorce, and remarriage, those bound is clearly in reference to a woman's husband. Those bound unto a wife is clearly in reference to a woman's husband, or those married, or those married. Let me read that again. In the context of Paul's letter on the issue of marriage, divorce, and remarriage, those bound unto a wife is clearly in reference to a woman's husband or those married. And those loose from a wife refers to the divorced, or those individuals whose spouses have died, meaning widows and widowers. The Greek words used for bound and loosed are deo, Strong's G 1210, and lucis, Strong's G 3080. And lucis is derived from the root word luo, which is the Strong's G 3089. Deo, my friends, means to bind or fasten, and it is used metaphorically to mean to be bound to one, that is a wife or a husband in marriage. While lucis means to be loosed and is used specifically in relation to being loosed from a marriage bond that is divorced in the context of this verse that Paul is speaking about. Therefore, Paul was making a clear contrast between those who are bound, that is married, and those who are loosed, that is divorced or widowed. Let's go to the original Greek so you can see the meaning of bound and loosed. So 1 Corinthians chapter 7, reading from verse 27, says, art thou bound unto a wife? Bound is Strong's G 1210. Deo. This is the pronunciation.
Strong's G 1210. Deo. Deo.
Deo. And it means, it has been translated, bind 37 times, tie 4 times, and we use of marriage. When persons get married, we say they tie the knot. Knit 1 time, be in bonds 1 time, wind 1 time. So it means to bind, tie, fasten. To bind, fasten with chains, to throw into chains. It is used metaphorically in this sense. It says, Satan is said to bind a woman bent together by a means of a demon as his messenger, taking possession of the woman and preventing her from standing upright, like the woman with issue of blood. Jesus said that she had been bound by Satan for these many years. To bind, put on the obligation of the law, duty, etc. To be bound to one, a wife or a husband. So bind means, in the context of what Paul was saying, it means to be married. And the context tells you, art thou bound unto a wife? You can only have a wife if you are married. So bound here means married, plain and simple. Seek not to be loose. Loose is Strong's G 3080. This is the meaning of, this is the pronunciation first.
Strong's G 3080. Lucis. Lucis.
Lucis. It is used only 1 time in the entire scriptures, and it means to be loosed. It means, outline of biblical usage, a loosing, setting free. It can be used of a prisoner when they have been acquitted or they have been let go of the bond of marriage, divorce. So if you are loose from a wife, it means you have been divorced or loose from a husband. Release, ransoming, deliverance, means or power of releasing or loosing, and it appears only 1 time. It says a loosening, that is especially a divorce in the context of this verse. So it is clear from the context that Paul was saying that if a person is loosed from a wife or a husband, seek not a wife. So let's go back to our notes. So again, the context of 1 Corinthians 7:27 is so clear for even the blind to see that both marriage and divorce are being contrasted, because Paul clearly states, art thou bound unto a wife, seek not to be loosed. Art thou loosed from a wife, seek not a wife. You can only seek a wife by getting married. Therefore, Paul's intervention on whether the divorced can remarry must now be put to bed, based on his words in 1 Corinthians 7, verse 28, which speaks specifically to those who are loosed. And he says, notice what he says, but and if thou marry, thou hast not sinned. So Paul was speaking, if you are divorced and you choose not to, and you choose to marry, thou hast not sinned. But Paul is saying, seek not a wife if you are divorced. But, and if thou marry, thou hast not sinned. So churches must desist from teaching this error, that the divorced cannot remarry because it lacks biblical support and is without foundation and basis. Paul's advice to both virgins and the divorced was to remain single because of the present distress. But if they chose to marry, they have not sinned. The apostle knew that there was great advantage in remaining single, especially at that particular time due to the present distress. But he was also cognizant, my friends, that every man had his proper gift of God, one after this manner and another after that manner, according to 1 Corinthians 7, verse 7. Some are able to remain celibate, some are able to abstain from sex, while others can't. So not everybody has the gift of celibacy or choose to be celibate. Therefore, Paul knew that not everyone would be able to contain their sexual desires and remain celibate. The scripture is absolutely clear that any unmarried individual, whether a virgin, widowed, or divorced, can marry with a clear conscience and without any guilt or shame. So churches should not make people feel guilty if they are divorced and have remarried. Friends, viewers, in continuing to advise the Corinthians, Paul warned against getting too attached to the comforts of this world and all it has to offer. Therefore, he encouraged persons to think with eternity in view, because this world and its goods are only temporal. Notice his words in 1 Corinthians 7, verse 29 onwards. But this I say, brethren, the time is short. It remaineth that both they that have wives be as though they had none, and they that weep as though they wept not, and they that rejoice as though they rejoice not, and they that buy as though they possess not, and they that use this world as not abusing it, for the fashion of this world passeth away. Paul's admonition was relevant because of the present distress and the potential trials that may occur in such a time. The apostle was not advocating for a man to be derelict in his duties and neglect his wife or family, but he was simply encouraging believers to live as if the time is short with an eye on eternity. Paul's words are still relevant even today for believers. We should not have our roots firmly planted in this world because it is fleeting and will pass away at the second coming of Christ. The apostle to the Gentiles, my friends, then explained the advantages and disadvantages of being married versus being single in the present distress. Notice again his words in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, reading from verse 32 onwards. But I would have you without carefulness. He that is unmarried careth for the things that belong to the Lord, how he may please the Lord. But he that is married careth for the things that are of the world, how he may please his wife. And then Paul says there's a difference also between a wife and a virgin, a married person and a single person. The unmarried woman cared for the things of the Lord, that she may be holy both in body and in spirit. But she that is married cared for the things of the world, how she may please her husband. And this I speak for your own profit, not that I may cast a snare upon you, but for that which is comely, and that ye may attend upon the Lord without distraction. Paul is very clear in his statement here. In this portion of the letter, Paul notes that an individual was able to serve the Lord better without the distraction of a spouse. However, Paul was not for one moment saying that it is wrong to be married or even get married. because everything that Paul wrote to the Corinthians must always be viewed within the context of the present distress. So Paul's advice, Paul's commandments that he got from the Lord had to be viewed that he was writing within the context of the present distress. That is very important for people to understand when they look at 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Evidence of Paul's support for marriage can clearly be seen in the following verses. 1 Corinthians 7 verse 2, 9 to 10, verses 27 to 28, and verse 36. Paul was very cognizant that it would be more difficult for the married to cope, and being unmarried or single at that time was considered more advantageous than being married. The apostle understood that being married during this present distress would mean that persons would have divided devotion or split loyalty between trying to please the Lord and trying to please their spouses. Therefore, this was precisely why Paul considered being unmarried or single more preferable at that time, because the unmarried would only need to think about the things of the Lord. Friends, in times of persecution, it may very well come down to persons choosing to stand up for God, even at the expense of giving up their lives in martyrdom. This may prove difficult to do if the married have husbands and wives to think about, and that is reasonable. Therefore, wavering between two decisions can prove to be very challenging and serve as a distraction for the married when compared to the unmarried who are free, single, and disengaged. Friends, in the next portion of his letter, Paul seemed to be addressing another question from the people of Corinth as to whether marriages should be arranged in the present distress. Note his response in the following verses found in 1 Corinthians 7, verse 36 onward. Paul said, "But if any man think that he behave himself uncomely toward his virgin, if she pass the flower of her age and need so require, let him do what he will. He sinneth not. Let them marry." This verse speaks to a man and his fiancée or his betrothed that he has strong sexual desires for, but doesn't want to deflower her before marriage. Paul tells such a man that if he cannot control his desires, then go right ahead and get married. Verse 37 said, "Nevertheless, he that standeth steadfast in his heart, having no necessity, but had power over his own will, and hath so decreed in his heart that he will keep his virgin, do it well." So Paul was saying, if you have such a strong desire and you cannot control it, then go right ahead and get married to avoid fornication. However, if you can purpose in your heart to control your sexual desires and remain celibate in this present distress, then such a person does well in that regard. Verse 38 says, "So then he that giveth her in marriage doeth well, but he that giveth her not in marriage doeth better." This verse outlines that fathers play a pivotal role as well in arranging marriages, and this is consistent with how things were done in ancient cultures and even today, where father gives away the bride. Paul was also making a comparison between married and being single. The apostle then viewed being single as better in light of the present circumstances facing the Corinthians. In closing his letter on the issue of marriage, divorce, and remarriage, Paul gave a reminder to widows concerning remarriage. This may have been necessitated because the Corinthians wanted to know if a widow is free to marry an unbeliever. Paul's response can be seen in the following verses in 1 Corinthians 7, and these are the last two verses in the chapter. 1 Corinthians 7, verses 39 and 40. This is what Paul wrote. "The wife is bound by the law as long as her husband liveth. But if her husband be dead, she is at liberty to be married to whom she will, only in the Lord. But she is happier if she so abide after my judgment. And I think also that I have the Spirit of God." The apostle's input in 1 Corinthians 7, verse 39 is important because many people believe and erroneously teach that only death ends a marriage, and they use Paul's words as support for their argument. Yes, in this verse, Paul is saying that death ends a marriage. So Paul is saying that the wife is bound by the law or the marriage vow, marriage covenant, as long as her husband liveth. So, but if her husband is dead, she's at liberty, the marriage ends, and she's at liberty to remarry. only in the Lord. So persons use this verse to say that only death ends the marriage, but they couldn't be more wrong. However, there are a couple of holes in such a view because one, it ignores and contradicts the totality of scriptures concerning the issue of divorce. And two, it also ignores the fact that divorce does what it was intended to do, that is to end a marriage. Friends, viewers, the scriptures are absolutely clear that a marriage can only come to an end in only two ways. One, divorce, and death. And this was already proven by looking at Deuteronomy 24, verse 1 to 4, in particular verse 3. And I'm going to go there to show that even in the divorce law that God gave, shows that there are two ways in which a marriage can come to an end. Let's go to Deuteronomy 24, verse 1 to 3. Because when we're looking at the marriage, when we're looking at marriage, divorce, and remarriage, everything must be viewed within the context of this law. Deuteronomy 24, verse 1 to 3 says, law of divorce. I'm going to read it 1 to 3. When a man had taken a wife and married her, so there's the marriage, and it come to pass that she find no favor in his eyes, because he had found some uncleanness in her, then let him write her a bill of divorcement, there's the divorce, and give it in her hand and send her out of his house. And when she is departed out of his house, she may go and be another man's wife. That is the remarriage. So the marriage is here, the divorce is here by the writing of a bill of divorcement, and then he sends her out of his house. And when she is departed out of his house, she may go and be another man's wife. So Deuteronomy 24, verse 1 to 2 speaks about marriage, divorce, and remarriage. But notice verse 3, which speaks about the two ways in which a marriage comes to an end. So this woman that was divorced, God says she may now go and be another man's wife. And notice verse 3. And if the latter husband, which is the second husband, hate her, and he doesn't love her anymore, he must do the same thing to end the marriage. He must write her a bill of divorcement and give it in her hand and send her out of his house, similar to what is done in verse 1 and 2. So this will end the marriage. The second husband must write her a bill of divorcement, give it in her hand, and then send her out of his house. So that is the divorce. That ends the marriage. And notice the other way in which a marriage ends. Or if the latter husband died, which took her to be his wife. So in verse 3, marriages come to an end in only two ways, divorce and death. So the latter husband is the second husband. He's now going to choose to divorce her again, but he must give her a bill of divorcement, and then he must send her out of his house. So that ends the marriage. And then if it says if the latter husband or the second husband, if he dies, the marriage comes to an end as well. And then notice verse 4. Her former husband, which is the first husband who divorced her, which sent her away, may not take her again to be his wife. After that, she's defiled to him. So the law is very clear that there are two ways in which a marriage can end. One, divorce, and two, death. That is plain and simple. So notice what I'm saying here. The scriptures are absolutely clear that a marriage can only come to an end by divorce or death. And this was already proven by looking at Deuteronomy 24, verse 1 to 3, which I just did. However, to provide further clarity on the matter, let's look at a parallel passage written by Paul himself to prove that divorce ends a marriage and also allows for remarriage. Romans 7, verse 2 to 3 is almost identical to 1 Corinthians 7, verse 39 in respect of a woman being free to marry after the death of her husband. However, let's read from verses 1 to 4, and I'm going to zero in on verse 4 because that is very crucial for the full context of Paul's teaching. Romans 7, verse 1 to 4. This is Paul writing to the Romans. But notice what he's saying. Know ye not, brethren, and I've highlighted brethren, I've put it in bold, and I've highlighted it in red. Know ye not, brethren, for I speak to them that know the law, how that the law hath dominion over a man as long as he liveth. There is absolutely no doubt that Paul was addressing Israel in verse 1, since he calls them brethren, which is Strong's G80. And then he adds a parenthetical statement, which is this bracket. So Paul makes a pause, says, "Know ye not, brethren," and then, so that there's no doubt, he says, "I am speaking to them that know the law." So Paul adds a parenthetical statement, "For I speak to them that know the law." And Paul here was speaking to Israel. Paul, by his own admission, was an Hebrew, an Israelite, and a seed of Abraham. And this can be seen in Philippians 3, verses 1 to 5, as well as 2 Corinthians 11, verse 22. Let me go there to prove that Paul was an Hebrew. 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 22. So 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 22. 2 Corinthians 11, verse 22. Notice what Paul says. Paul says here. Paul says, "Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they the seed of Abraham? So am I." So Paul was saying that he's an Hebrew, he's an Israelite, and I'm speaking to them who know the law. And let's go to Romans chapter 7 to look at the word brethren. Romans 7, verse 1, which is the passage in question. "Know ye not, brethren." Notice who is Paul's brethren. Brethren has many meanings. So it means adelphos. This is the pronunciation.
Strong's G80, adelphos. Adelphos.
Okay, adelphos. It means brethren, brother, brothers, brothers way. Outline of biblical usage. This is how it is used in the scriptures. A brother, whether born of the same two parents or only of the same father or mother. So it's in this case, it's referring to a biological brother. And Paul was speaking in this sense, having the same national ancestor, belonging to the same people or countryman. So Paul was saying that, "Know ye not, brethren, and I speak to them that know the law." So he was speaking to national Israel. Israel belong to the same ancestor. That is why it says, "Are they the seed of Abraham? So am I. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I." So Paul was addressing clearly those who are of the stock of Israel in this part of his letter to the Romans. So Paul, by his own admission, was an Hebrew, an Israelite, and a seed of Abraham. The law in question is in reference to the law of Moses, which all Israel knew and was schooled in. So all Israelites were trained and educated in the law of Moses. They were trained and schooled in the Old Covenant. Paul was at that time speaking to his countrymen who know the law and pay keen attention to his use of the present tense instead of the past tense knew. So he was speaking to people who currently know the law. Verse 2 now, which is identical to 1 Corinthians 7, verse 39. Notice what Paul says to the Romans in Romans 7, verse 2. "For the woman which hath an husband is bound by the law to her husband, so long as he liveth," which is similar to 1 Corinthians 7, verse 39. "But if the husband be dead, she is loosed." There's the word loosed again. "She is free from the law of her husband, because death ends the marriage. So then, if while her husband liveth, she be married to another, she shall be called an adulteress," which is what Jesus said in Mark 10, verse 12. "But if her husband be dead, she is free from that law," the marriage law, "so that she is no adulteress, though she be married to another man." So widows can remarry. This verse makes the point that death ends a marriage. Nobody is doubting that, and clearly allows for remarriage to a second spouse. Wherefore, notice verse 4 now. This is the verse in question, or the verse that proves that divorced individuals can remarry. Notice verse 4, and bear in mind that Paul was speaking to Israel, God's people. Wherefore, my brethren, there it is again, my brethren, people who have the same national ancestor, in particular Abraham, because Abraham had Isaac, Isaac had Jacob, Jacob had 12 sons, which are called the 12 tribes of Israel, because Jacob's name was renamed to Israel. So wherefore, my brethren, ye also are become dead to the law by the body of Christ, that ye should be married to another, even to him who is raised from the dead, that we should bring forth unto God. So Paul was saying to the Israelites, ye are become dead to the law by the body of Christ, and that ye should be married to another. Should means future, even to him who is raised from the dead. Romans 7 verse 4, my friends, is absolutely crucial in making the case that divorce ends a marriage and allows for remarriage as well. You might ask, how so based on this verse? Keep in mind that Paul was speaking to Israel, God's wife under the old covenant. Remember, God had married Israel at Sinai. So Israel became God's wife. Jeremiah 3 verse 14 records God pleading with his wayward wife to return. And this is what God said. Turn, O backsliding children, saith Jehovah. Why? For I am married unto you. This is God speaking. God said that he is married at that time to Israel. However, Israel refused to return. And as a result, God divorced her. God is a divorcee. The father is a divorcee. God the Father is a divorcee. God pleaded with them to return. They refused to return, and God divorced her because of her adulteries. And so God divorced her, as can be seen in Jeremiah 3 verse 8, which states, and this is what God said. Again, so after pleading with her to return, because he was married unto her, she refused to return. And notice what God said in Jeremiah 3 verse 8. And I saw when for all the causes whereby backsliding Israel, there it is, backsliding Israel, God's wife, committed adultery, I had put her away and given her a bill of divorce. So God followed his own law, laid out in Deuteronomy 24, verse 1 to 4, because the law required that if a man is going to put away his wife, he must write her a bill of divorcement, put it in her hand, and send her out of his house. God gave Israel a bill of divorce and put her away. So God followed his own law by giving his wife Israel a bill of divorce and then put her away. God's divorce from Israel ended the marriage covenant that was ratified in blood at Sinai in Exodus 24, verse 3 to 8. Romans 7, verse 4, my friends, makes the point that this same Israel, which now includes both Jews and Gentiles, this same Israel, God's ex-wife, by virtue of her divorce from her first husband, God the Father, is free to be married to another. That's what verse 4 says. That because they have been divorced, they are free to be married to another, even to him, that is Jesus Christ, who is raised from the dead. This is precisely why the church, or the Israel of God, is referred to as the bride of Christ, or the Lamb's wife. And you can see 2 Corinthians 11, verse 2, which speaks about the church being espoused unto one husband. And Revelation 21, verse 9, which speaks about the church being the Lamb's wife. Romans 7, verse 1 to 4 is absolutely clear that Israel, God's ex-wife, is espoused to one husband. Let me just look at these verses just to show you the text. 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 2. 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 2. Like to be very detailed. So this is Paul writing. 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 2. For I am jealous over you with godly jealousy. For I have espoused here means to be engaged, to be betrothed. I have espoused you to one husband. And who is that husband? That I may present you as a chaste virgin to Christ. So the church is espoused, is engaged, is Christ betrothed, and he's going to be her husband. So Paul says, I have espoused you to one husband, that I may present you as a chaste virgin to Christ. And then Revelation 19, verse 9. Revelation 19, verse 9. Notice what the text says. And he said unto me, right. This is speaking about the marriage supper of the Lamb, which is the point I'm going to make later. And he said unto me, right, blessed are they which are called unto the marriage supper of the Lamb. The Lamb is Jesus. And he said unto me, these are the true sayings of God. So when Jesus comes the second time, he's going to take his bride home to his father's house. And they are going to have this marriage. And all are invited, all who have accepted Christ are invited to this marriage supper of the Lamb. So Christ is the person to whom the church is going to be married to. So Romans 7 verse 4 is absolutely clear that Israel, God's ex-wife, is espoused to one husband and is scheduled to be married to Christ at the marriage supper of the Lamb, which I just read. Therefore, there is no doubt that both death and divorce ends a marriage and allows for an individual to be married to another. Because Romans 7 verse 4 makes the point that God's ex-wife Israel is espoused to one husband, and that because she is now divorced from God, Jeremiah 3 verse 8, she is now free to be married to another, even to him who is raised from the dead. And we know that is speaking of Jesus Christ. So in making my final points, Paul ends his letter on this subject by stating that a widow is at liberty to be married to whom she will, only in the Lord. This caveat by Paul clearly means that the widow should only marry a believer or a Christian, since the Lord here refers to Christ. And you can see Acts 10:36 and Romans 4 verse 9, which makes that point. Paul then closes by again stating that the widow would be happier if she so abide after my judgment, that is, to be single because of the present distress. In closing, my friends, this series on marriage, divorce, and remarriage, it has been clearly shown that God's ideal was for marriage to be between one man and one woman for life. However, because of the hardness of men's hearts, God instituted the divorce law found in Deuteronomy 24, verse 1 to 4, as a means of protection for women against the treachery of men. Because many husbands simply chose to put away their wives without the requisite bill of divorcement, which was contrary to the law. It was also demonstrated that God's law allows for remarriage even after divorce. And Romans 7 verse 4 makes that point very clearly. The entire chapter of 1 Corinthians 7 makes the case in this regard, because Paul states very clearly that the unmarried and those loose from a wife can marry, and if they do, commit no sin. Paul was absolutely clear again, my friends, that when he commanded that to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife and let every woman have her own husband. So that, my friends, was a detailed explanation of 1 Corinthians chapter 7. This concludes the series on marriage, divorce, and remarriage. I hope that these series of presentations were very helpful in clarifying some very difficult passages and has given much further clarity on this whole issue of marriage, divorce, and remarriage. And persons having viewed this presentation and the presentation in this series should now have a better understanding of what the scriptures mean or states as it relates to this whole issue of marriage, divorce, and remarriage, which is a very controversial topic. But if we allow the scriptures and the scriptures alone and allow the Holy Spirit to teach us and guide us, then I'm sure that we will have a better understanding of these important issues. Thanks again for participating throughout this series. I solicit your comments. If this series of presentation was a blessing to you, I would recommend that you share it with others so they too can be similarly blessed. Leave a comment. I'm prepared to answer any and all comments. Just be respectful in your posts, and I will get back to you to answer any questions that you may pose. Thanks for listening, and may God continue to bless us, and have yourselves a wonderful day as we continue to study and share the word of God so people can be edified and God's will can be done. Thanks again for listening, and may God continue to bless us all richly in Jesus Christ.